The sonar operator aboard the research vessel Kaijin Maru had spent 9 years listening to the dark, and in all that time, the deep had only ever answered in the language of the deep, the groan of pressure, the tick of biology, the long empty hiss of water that had never seen the sun. So when the return came back that night, 40 kilometers off the Chiba coast and 2,000 meters down, Petty Officer Sei Kuroda did not believe it. She believed her equipment had failed. The screen showed geometry, not the soft, accidental geometry of a seamount or a trench. Hard lines, right angles, a grid of them, sprawling across the abyssal plain like a circuit board, and rising out of that grid, structures, towers, domes, a skyline pressed flat by 400 atmospheres, and still, impossibly, standing. The sonar painted it in returns so clean they looked drawn. And through the hull, faint as a rumor, came a sound the ocean had no business making. Music. She would tell the review board later that it sounded like a phonograph heard through a wall. A woman's voice, warped by depth and distance, singing something old and American and unbearably sad. The board would not write that down. But Kuroda heard it, and the ship's hydrophones caught enough of it that the recording still exists in a Hero Public Safety Commission vault, filed under a designation that means, "Do not play this for the public." By dawn, the anomaly had a name in 3 government ministries, and none of them agreed on what it was. By noon, the commission had classified it. By evening, they had called Endeavor. He came because no one else could be trusted to survive whatever was down there, and because he was the #1 hero, and the title was still new enough on his shoulders that he wore it like armor that hadn't been broken in. Enji Todoroki stood on the deck of a commissioned survey ship in the gray pre-storm light and looked at the water and felt, for the first time in years, something he had trouble naming. It took him the whole approach to recognize it. It was unease. The dive itself was not his. Even the flame hero could not descend 2 kilometers into crushing dark. His fire was useless where there was no oxygen to feed it. So the commission sent a submersible, a reinforced bathyscaphe crewed by 3, a pilot, a commissioned technician, and a young rescue hero named Kaito Mizushima, whose quirk let him breathe water and endure pressure that would fold an ordinary man like paper. Endeavor watched the vessel go under from the deck monitors. His reflection ghosted over the descent feed, and he did not like that either. The feed held for 90 minutes. It showed the descent, the blue draining out of the water, the black rising up to meet them, the strange snowfall of marine detritus drifting past the lights. And then, at 1,800 meters, it showed the city. Later, everyone who watched that footage described the same thing first. Not the size of it, though it was vast. Not the horror, though that came. What they described first was that Rapture was beautiful. It rose out of the seabed in the sweeping curves and stepped crowns of a style a century dead, an aesthetic of gold and glass and confidence, of men who had believed the future belonged to them. Neon still burned behind cracked windows, red and green and electric blue, powered by something no one could explain, painting slogans in a language the technician read aloud in a voice that got quieter as he went. No gods or kings, only man. Great glass tubes ran between the towers like arteries, and through them, here and there, small dark shapes moved that the crew told themselves were fish. They were not fish. Kaito Mizushima was the one who left the submersible. His quirk made him the only member of the team who could, and the commission's orders were explicit: establish whether the structure was inhabited. He swam out into the glow of a plaza where a fountain still ran, water inside water, and he approached a set of tall bronze doors, and he pressed his gloved hand against the metal, and the recording captured him saying, softly, wonderingly, "It's warm." 2 kilometers down, in water 3 degrees above freezing, the metal was warm. Then the doors opened, and the feed cut, and for 4 hours, the Kaijin Maru and the entire commission apparatus above sat in silence, believing they had lost all 3. They surfaced at 2:47 in the morning. The submersible breached on its own power with the pilot unconscious, the technician weeping and unable to speak, and Kaito Mizushima sitting perfectly upright in the flooded rescue bay, calm, unhurt, and changed. Endeavor met him on the deck. The young hero looked up at the #1 with an expression of profound and peaceful clarity, water sheeting off his skin, And when he opened his hand, there was a small glass vial resting in his palm, filled with a substance that glowed a deep and living crimson, pulsing gently, like something with a heartbeat. "They gave me a gift," Kaito said. His voice was wrong, too serene, the voice of a man who had found religion in a place that had no business holding any. "They said I could be more than I was born, that none of us have to accept what we were given." He smiled, and there was blood at the corner of his mouth, thin and bright, though nothing had struck him. "It doesn't care about your quirk, Endeavor. It doesn't care what you were born with. It just makes you more." Endeavor took the vial. Up close, the light of it moved against the ridges of his fingerprints, and he felt, through the glass, through his glove, a faint answering warmth in his own blood, a pull, like the substance recognized something in him and wanted in. He was the #1 hero. He had spent his entire life becoming the most powerful thing his birth allowed him to be, clawing toward a summit that a boy named Izuku Midoriya and a ghost named All Might had shown him he might never truly reach. And here in his hand was a thing that whispered the summit was a lie. That power was not a birthright to be earned across a lifetime of blood. That power was a product, and it could simply be bought. He closed his fist around the vial and did not let his face move. It's worth stepping out of the depths for a moment, because a story like this one, a whole drowned city surfacing out of nowhere with its secrets and its horrors intact, is exactly the kind of premise this channel lives on, and this particular descent was suggested by a viewer who goes by Mr. Grimm, so credit where it's due, though the writing's all mine. If you want to see where your own favorite world would fracture if it collided with another, subscribe and drop a comment naming a universe and a character. Any universe, any character, and it might be the next city we pull up out of the dark. Now, back down. The debrief happened in a sealed commission facility, and Enji Todoroki was one of only 4 people permitted inside. The others were Madam President of the Hero Public Safety Commission, a stone-faced woman whose given name almost no one alive knew, a commission scientist named Dr. Haruki Nomura, whose hands would not stop trembling as he studied the vial's readouts, and, by video link, retired and gaunt in his skeletal true form, Toshinori Yagi, All Might, who was no one's hero anymore but whose judgment the commission still, quietly, could not do without. "The substance," Nomura said, "does not match any quirk factor on record. It isn't inherited. It isn't a mutation of the quirk singularity." He swallowed. "As near as I can tell, it rewrites the body directly. It gives the recipient abilities, plural, the way a quirk gives one. But it can be administered, injected, to anyone." His eyes came up, and they were frightened, including the quirkless. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped down a well, and everyone present felt how far it had to fall. Toshinori Yagi, who had spent the back half of his life quirkless in every way that mattered, who had given his last embers of One for All to a boy and become an ordinary dying man, went very still on the screen. He, more than anyone in that room, understood what had just been said. 20% of the population had no quirk. 20% lived in a world built by and for the powered, locked out of heroism, out of respect, out of the great glittering machine of celebrity and rank. And a city at the bottom of the sea had just offered them a door. "You understand what this is," All Might said quietly, and it was not a question. "It is not a weapon we could contain. This is a promise, and promises, once people hear them, cannot be unheard." Madam President's expression did not change. "Then we ensure the public never hears it." "You cannot bury a city," All Might said. "We have buried larger things than a city." Endeavor said nothing through all of it. He stood at the far end of the room with the vial's readouts glowing on the monitor, and his arms crossed over the great furnace of his chest, and he thought about Kaito Mizushima sitting serene in the flooded bay, blood at his lip, telling the #1 hero that everything he was had been an accident of birth, that money could correct. He thought about the summit he would never reach. He thought about the sun, and about the green boy, and about how far he had come and how it had never once felt like enough. And he was honest with himself, in the private furnace of his own skull. In a way, heroes are rarely honest. He did not, in that moment, entirely want the city buried. That frightened him more than anything the deep had shown. 2,000 meters below them, in a boardroom turned throne room lined with mahogany and brass, A man in a good suit poured himself a drink and watched the little surface dwellers on his own screens. For Rapture had eyes, and Rapture had known they were coming long before the sonar sang. Andrew Ryan swirled the liquor and considered the ships blotting his sky, the little floating governments with their little regulated heroes, and he smiled the smile of a man who has seen a parasite crawl to his doorstep and mistake itself for a savior. So, he said, to no one, to the city, to himself. The great outside comes calling at last. He set down the glass. Let them come. Let them see what a man builds when no God, no king, and no committee is permitted to steal it from him. His voice hardened, and somewhere in the deep machinery he owned began quietly to wake. And let them learn what happens to parasites who reach for the fruit of another man's labor. Above, on the deck of the survey ship, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, and the rain came down hard and cold on the black water. And beneath the black water, the drowned lights of Rapture burned on, patient and warm, and waiting. The commission did not decide to make contact so much as fail to prevent it. They had wanted, in the days that followed, to seal the anomaly behind a wall of classification and study it from a safe and deniable distance. But cities do not sit quietly to be studied, and Rapture least of all. On the third night, every hydrophone in the survey fleet lit up at once, and the drowned city reached up through 2 kilometers of black water and spoke. It came through on every open commission channel, which should not have been possible, riding a carrier signal Dr. Nomura's people could not source. A man's voice, unhurried, cultured, carrying the flat vowels of a century-dead American aristocracy, and the iron underneath them. It did not sound like a distress call. It sounded like a landlord addressing tenants who had let themselves in. "I am Andrew Ryan," the voice said, "and I built the city you are floating over. I built it in the dark and the cold, precisely so that men like you would never find it. And yet here you are." A pause, dry as a struck match. The great outside, the nations, the committees. "You have come a very long way to knock on my door. I confess a certain curiosity as to what you imagine you will find behind it." Endeavor was in the commission command tent when the transmission came, and he watched Madam President's face do the small, dangerous thing it did when a variable refused to be managed. She had spent 3 days building a strategy for a derelict. She had prepared for salvage, for containment, for a dead ruin she could pick clean of its terrible secret and then forget. She had not prepared for a landlord. "Establish contact," she said. "Ascertain his intentions." "His intentions," said the young rescue hero Kaito Mizushima, who had not left the fleet since his return, and who now sat too calm at the edge of the tent. That thin, bright line of blood dried at the corner of his mouth, "are the same as they've always been. He wants to be left alone with what he built." He smiled that peaceful, ruined smile. "You won't manage it. Nobody ever does. The parasite always reaches." They put him under guard after that. It did not stop him talking. The second contact was face-to-face, and Endeavor insisted on being the one to descend, over the commission's objections and his own quiet dread. They could not put the #1 hero at the bottom of the sea, but Rapture solved that problem itself, because the city sent up a vessel to fetch its guests. It rose out of the dark on the 4th morning, and breached beside the fleet with a groan of ancient hydraulics, a bathysphere, a great riveted sphere of brass and glass, shaped like a diving bell, dreamed up by a man who thought elegance and function were the same virtue. Its round door stood open. Its meaning was not subtle. "You may enter my house, on my terms, in my conveyance." Endeavor went, because someone had to, and because he did not trust anyone else to walk into that and come out the same person. He went alone, at Ryan's stipulation. The commission wired him for sound and swallowed their objections, and Madam President's last instruction to him was 3 words: "Learn everything, promise nothing." The descent took 20 minutes, and they were the strangest 20 minutes of Enji Todoroki's life. The bathysphere sank through the blue and into the black, and a phonograph mounted in its brass housing crackled to life unbidden and played that same warped American song the sonar operator had heard, a woman's voice from 100 years dead singing about the sea. And Endeavor sat in the small warm sphere, with his own flame banked to an ember so as not to consume the air, and watched a dead world's beauty rise up around him. The neon, the gold, The great glass arteries, and the shapes moving inside them, clearer now, close enough that he could no longer pretend they were fish, men, women, things that had been men and women, their bodies wrong in the low light, hunched and twitching and fast, watching the bathysphere pass with eyes that caught the neon and threw it back. The sphere docked inside a station of vaulted glass, and the water drained away with a shriek of pumps, and the door opened onto Rapture proper, and Endeavor stepped out into the drowned dream of Andrew Ryan and understood, finally and fully, that he was not in a ruin. He was in a country, one that was dying, and had been dying for a while, and had made its peace with the dying, and gone on being itself anyway. The corridors were water-stained mahogany and cracked marble. Posters lined the walls, advertisements for a life that had ended, for plasmids, for gene tonics, for a hero named Sinclair, and a product named Adam, smiling Art Deco faces promising strength and beauty and power in a bottle. Water dripped somewhere with the patience of centuries. And through it all, on speakers hidden in the walls, Andrew Ryan narrated his own city to his guest as he walked him deeper into it, a disembodied voice, warm and ceaseless and utterly certain, laying out a philosophy the way a proud man lays out a table. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? The voice asked, and it was clearly a thing Ryan had said before, a scripture worn smooth by repetition. No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. Endeavor walked and listened and said nothing, because he had learned in a lifetime of press conferences that the surest way to make a man reveal himself is to give him silence to fill. He met Ryan at last in a great office suspended over the city, a room of dark wood and green-shaded lamps and windows that looked out on the drowned skyline, the neon and the towers and, far below, the small, terrible movement of the things that lived there now. Andrew Ryan stood at the glass with his back to the door, a tall man, older than his voice, immaculate in a suit that had been the height of fashion in a decade no one living remembered, a cigarette burning forgotten between two fingers. He did not turn around. The number one hero, Ryan said, tasting the phrase, finding it distasteful. They send me their champion, their symbol, the most powerful man their little system of birthrights and licenses and rankings has managed to produce. Now he turned, and his eyes were pale and sharp and entirely unafraid. Tell me, champion, who gave you your power? No one gave it to me, Endeavor said. I was born with it. Ryan's smile was thin and cold and delighted. Born with it. Yes, of course you were. That is the entire rotten foundation of the world you come from, isn't it? Power dispensed by the accident of birth, handed out by God, or genetics, or whatever committee you've assembled to pretend those are different, and the men who receive it are made kings, heroes, you call them, but the word means the same. And the men who do not? He gestured, cigarette trailing smoke, at the city beyond the glass. The men who do not are told to accept their place, to be grateful, to be saved by their betters. His voice dropped. I built this city for the men who would not accept their place. I built it so that a man might make himself into whatever he had the will to become, not what he was permitted to become by the accident of his blood. And Endeavor, who had spent his entire life becoming the most powerful thing his blood allowed, who had married a woman for the shape of her quirk and broken his own children on the anvil of his ambition, and only lately begun to understand the size of what he had done, Endeavor felt the words land somewhere he had not armored. And what did they become? He said, and nodded at the twitching shapes below. Your men who would not accept their place. What are they now? For the first time, something flickered behind Ryan's certainty. It was gone, almost before it appeared. But Endeavor was a hunter, and he saw it, a hairline crack in the granite. Grief, maybe, or fear, or the particular hollow horror of a man watching his life's work rot from the inside and refusing to name the reason. There was a parasite, Ryan said, very quietly, and now the philosophy had gone out of his voice and left something older and more tired underneath. A man named Fontaine. He sold the people a dream, and then he sold them a chain, and he called the chain freedom. And by the time I understood what he had done, the city was already... He stopped. His jaw worked. Adam was to be the crowning glory of the human will. Power, purchasable, earned by the enterprise of the men who created it. Instead, it became a hunger, a market in the one thing no market should ever touch. He looked at Endeavor with sudden, terrible directness. You have felt it. Already. In 3 days. I can see it on you. The thing your dead world calls a hero, and it wants. Tell me I'm wrong. Endeavor did not tell him he was wrong. The silence stretched. Somewhere below, one of the twitching shapes let out a cry that echoed up through the drowned towers. Not an animal sound, and not quite a human one. The sound of something that remembered being a person, and could not get back. Ryan flinched at it. He tried to hide the flinch and failed, and in that failure Endeavor read the whole shape of the thing. A tyrant in a tomb of his own making, presiding over the ruin of the one idea he had loved more than any person, too proud to flee it and too honest, in his way, to lie about it. Here is what you will tell your committee, Ryan said, gathering himself, the granite closing back over the crack. Rapture is not for sale. Its secrets are not for sale. I will not have the great outside come down into my city and cart off my life's work to be regulated by the same parasites I spent my fortune escaping. You will leave. You will forget you found me. And if you do not, he crushed the cigarette out in a crystal tray with slow deliberation, you will find that a dying city is a very dangerous thing, champion. It has nothing left to lose. And I have a great deal of Adam, and a great many men who will do anything at all for the promise of more. You don't control them anymore, Endeavor said. It was not a guess. The city. Your men. You've lost them. That's why you're talking to me instead of killing me. You need the outside to think you're still king down here. Because down here, you're not sure you are. Ryan looked at him for a long moment, and something in the look was almost respect. Get out of my city, he said. The bathysphere carried Endeavor back up through the black, the phonograph playing its dead song, and he sat in the small warm sphere with his flame banked low, and stared at the Adam advertisements he'd photographed on his phone, the smiling faces, the bottled power. You can be a hero, no quirk required, and felt the pull of it in his own altered blood, the whisper the vial had put there. And he understood, rising toward the surface, and the storm, and the waiting commission, that the true danger of Rapture had never been Andrew Ryan. The true danger was that Ryan was right about one thing, and the world above was about to find out. Because far below, in a flooded plaza Ryan no longer patrolled, a different voice had been listening to the whole exchange on a stolen frequency. A warmer voice, a kinder voice, with a working man's lilt and a father's gentleness, the voice of someone who had heard the surface dwellers arrive, and had been waiting, so patiently, for exactly this. Would you kindly hold on now? It murmured to the dark, to itself, to the little girls humming in the vents. The heroes come. The rich man's had his say, and Frank Fontaine, wearing the name Atlas the way another man wears a coat, smiled up at the retreating light of the bathysphere. My turn. The vial did not stay in the vault. That was the first crack, and it was a small one, and it happened the way most catastrophes happen. Not through malice, but through a chain of reasonable people, each making a defensible choice. Dr. Nomura needed live tissue assays to understand what Adam did, and the commission needed to understand what Adam did before it could decide how to bury it, and so a fraction of a milliliter went from the vault to a sealed biolab in a commission research annex, outside Tokyo, escorted by armed heroes and logged-in triplicate. Everything was done correctly. Everything was accounted for. And a lab technician named Ren Kobayashi, 34 years old, quirkless his entire life, watched the crimson substance pulse under the microscope for 6 straight nights, and did the math that the commission had spent a week refusing to do out loud. He had grown up quirkless in a world where 4 out of 5 people were not. He had spent his childhood being told, gently and cruelly, that he simply could not do the things the other children did, could not join the playfights that were rehearsals for heroism, could not dream the dream the whole culture was built around, could not be more. He had made his peace with it the way the quirkless learned to, by becoming useful in the margins the powered didn't want. He was good at his job. He was invisible. and on the sixth night he sat alone in a commissioned biolab with a substance that did not care what a person had been born with, that rewrote the body directly, that made anyone, into something more. He did not steal a large amount. He told himself, in the way of a man building his own trapdoor, that he was only taking enough to study at home, enough to understand. He drew off a few microliters into a capped syringe, and he walked it out past security in the false bottom of a lunchbox, and the logs did not catch it, because the logs were built to track the vial, and no one had thought to weigh what the vial contained, down to the last drop, because no one on that team had ever, for one day of their lives, known what it was to be told they could never be more. That is the thing the Commission failed to understand, and it is the thing this whole story turns on. They had treated Adam as a secret, as information to be contained, but Adam was not information. It was a promise, and it had already been made, and it had been made specifically to the 1/5 of humanity that the machine of hero society had spent a century quietly writing off. You cannot contain a promise like that. You can only decide how many people get to hear it before it burns the walls down. Ren Kobayashi heard it, and Ren Kobayashi injected himself, alone, in the bathroom of his small apartment, at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, with a substance grown in the body of a little girl at the bottom of the sea. It is worth saying what happened to him, because the Commission would spend a great deal of effort making sure the public never did. For about 4 hours, it was everything the posters promised. The Adam rewrote him. A quirkless man for 34 years, Ren Kobayashi stood in his tiny kitchen at 3 in the morning and held out his hand and made frost bloom across the counter, winter blast unspooling from his palm in a crackle of white. And he wept, because he had been told his entire life that this was a thing his body was simply not built to do. And here it was, doing it. He had bought his way into the story that had locked him out. For 4 hours he was, at last, more. By dawn the frost was coming without his willing it. By noon he could not stop his left hand from shaking. By the second day the voices had started. Not hallucinations exactly, but a pressure behind the eyes, an appetite, a certainty that he needed more, that the 4 hours of grace had been a loan, and the interest was coming due, that somewhere out there was more Adam, and he had to have it. By the third day Ren Kobayashi was not answering his phone, and his neighbors had begun to complain about the cold that leaked from under his door and the sounds he made. And when a low-ranked local hero finally forced the apartment open, he found something that had been a gentle, invisible man crouched in a corner of frost-rimed ruin, and it looked at the hero with eyes gone strange and bright, and it said, in a voice full of grief and hunger, "You have some. I can smell it. Would you kindly give it to me?" He had never been to Rapture. He had never heard the name Fontaine, but the words came out of him anyway, and no one above ground yet understood why. They took him. It required 3 heroes, and it was not gentle, and it was, the report would note in language scrubbed of all feeling, not a rescue. And in a commission facility, restrained, coming down off the Adam into a withdrawal that no one had the medicine to treat, Ren Kobayashi told them everything, where he'd worked, what he'd taken, how easy it had been, and then he asked, through chattering teeth, the question that broke the last person in the room who still had a heart. Was I wrong to want it? Nobody answered him. Endeavor was not in the room, but he read the transcript, and he read it in the Commission's inner briefing hall with Madam President at the head of the table, and Dr. Nomura looking like a man who had not slept, and by video link, gaunt and grave, Toshinori Yagi. And when Endeavor finished reading it, he set the tablet down very carefully, because he did not trust his hands, and he said the thing that had been building in him since the bathysphere. "We are going to lose control of this. We have already lost a fraction of a milliliter," said Madam President. "That is not the same as losing control." "It is the same," All Might said quietly from the screen, "as losing everything. You are thinking like a woman guarding a weapon. One leak, contained, the breach sealed. But this is not a weapon." He leaned forward, the light catching the deep hollows of his ruined face. One man heard the promise, and it destroyed him. And when the people learn, when, not if, that there is a substance which grants power to the quirkless, that lifts the one barrier this entire society is built upon, he stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had the terrible weight of a man who had once been the load-bearing pillar of a civilization, and knew exactly how much it could hold. Do you understand what our world is, Madam President? It is a peace, built entirely on the fact that power is distributed by birth and cannot be redistributed by choice. The strong are born strong and the weak are born weak, and everyone has organized their whole life around the belief that this cannot be changed. Heroes, villains, the licensing system, the rankings, the commission itself. Every institution we have exists to manage an inequality that everyone believes is permanent. His hand closed slowly into a fist that had once held up the sky, and a city at the bottom of the sea has just proven it is for sale. The silence in the room had weight. The quirkless will want it, Nomura said, mostly to himself, the scientist reaching the conclusion the ethicist had reached 3 sentences ago. Of course they'll want it, and the villains, and, he swallowed, and some of the heroes. Anyone who ever hit the ceiling of what they were born with. Anyone who ever wanted to be more than their quirk allowed. Endeavor, Madam President said, and it was not quite an accusation, but it was aimed. She had read his medical scans. She knew about the trace resonance in his altered blood, the thing the vial had put there through a glove. You have felt it. Speak plainly. If I put a full dose of Adam on this table and told you it would take you past the summit, past the boy, past All Might's ghost, past every ceiling your birth ever set, would you refuse it? Every person in the room looked at the #1 hero. And Enji Todoroki, who had spent his life wanting exactly that one thing more than he had wanted his own children's love, looked at the table for a long moment, and then he told the truth, because he had lately, painfully, been learning to. I don't know, he said, and that is why I am telling you we have already lost control. Because if I don't know, a man who has finally, at the cost of everything, begun to understand what my ambition costs the people around me, then the 18-year-old with a weak quirk and a dream, the villain with a grudge, the parent watching their quirkless child cry the way I once, he stopped. He did not finish it. He didn't have to. They will not hesitate. They will not agonize. They will hear that power is for sale, and they will go down into the dark and buy it, and this world will never, ever be the same. Madam President was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The manager's certainty had gone out of it, replaced by something colder and more frightened and, in its way, more dangerous. Then we do not merely bury the city, she said. We seize it, every drop of Adam, the means of its production, all of it, under commission control, permanently, before the promise spreads. She looked at each of them in turn. If power is going to be for sale in this world, gentlemen, then it will be sold by us, on our terms, to whom we choose. Or it will not be sold at all. Nomura went pale. All Might closed his eyes. And Endeavor understood, in that moment, that the commission had just stopped being frightened of Rapture and started wanting to become it, and that somewhere down in the drowning dark, Andrew Ryan, who had spent his life warning that the parasite always reaches for the fruit of another man's labor, would have laughed until he wept to hear it. He also understood something the commission did not, because he had stood in that city, and he had seen the twitching shapes in the glass, and he had heard the peaceful ruin in Kaito Mizushima's voice, and the hunger in Ren Kobayashi's, and he knew a thing the briefing hall did not yet know. You could not administer Adam the way the commission imagined. It was not a resource to be rationed from on high. It was a hunger that ate the one who took it. The commission thought they were about to acquire the greatest strategic asset in the history of hero society. They were about to inherit a plague. And down in the dark, on his stolen frequency, the warm voice that called itself Atlas had heard enough of the surface's chatter to know exactly which lie to tell them next. The message came addressed to the heroes, not the commission, and that was the first sign that whoever sent it understood the world above far better than it understood him. It arrived on the 5th day after Ren Kobayashi, riding the same untraceable carrier signal Ryan had used. But where Ryan's transmission had commandeered the commission's secured channels, this one bled out across the open ones, the public hero agency networks, the emergency dispatch bands, the frequencies that ordinary rescue heroes monitored in 100 cities. It was as if the sender had looked at the surface world and seen, immediately, that the commission was the head, but the heroes were the heart, and that hearts were so much easier to reach. The voice was warm, That was the thing everyone remarked on afterward, in the wreckage. It was a working man's voice, roughened and kind, with a lilt that made you lean in. Where Ryan had lectured, this man confided. Where Ryan had held the surface at arm's length as a parasite, this man reached out to it like a drowning brother. To whoever's listening up there. To the heroes, I mean. The real ones, not the suits. My name is Atlas. A breath. Weary. Honest sounding. I'm just a working man. I got a wife. I got children. And I'm down here in the dark of a city that a rich man built and then let rot. And there's thousands like me trapped down here with him. The poor. The forgotten. The ones Ryan used up and threw away. The voice cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. He's told you to leave. Course he has. He'd rather we all died in the dark than let the outside world see what he's done. But you're heroes. You save people. That's the whole of what you are, isn't it? So I'm begging you. Not for me. For the children down here. Would you kindly come and get us out? Later, much later, when the whole shape of it was finally visible, analysts would sit and dissect that transmission phrase by phrase and marvel at the craftsmanship of it. Because Frank Fontaine had built a lure with a hook set for every fish in the pond, and he had done it in under 2 minutes. For the rank-and-file heroes, he offered the one thing the profession was supposedly built on, and so rarely got to do purely, an unambiguous rescue. No politics, no rankings, no license paperwork, no commission oversight. Just the poor and the trapped and the drowning, begging to be saved. It cut straight past every jaded layer a working hero accumulates, and struck the reason they'd wanted the job at 14. For the public, because of course the transmission leaked. Of course it did. It had been designed to leak. He offered a villain and a victim in the oldest and most legible story there is. A rich man hoarding a secret at the bottom of the sea, while the poor died around him. It wrote its own headlines. And for the commission, he offered a problem. Because the moment that transmission hit the open bands, the calculus changed. They could no longer quietly bury a derelict. The derelict had a voice now, and the voice had a wife and children. And if the Hero Public Safety Commission was seen to leave a working man and his family to die in the dark to protect a secret, the public would not forgive it. And worse, the heroes would not forgive it. Madam President understood within the hour that Atlas had boxed her in with 3 sentences and a catch in his voice. She could not let the heroes go down to rescue him without losing control of the atom. She could not stop them without looking like a monster. She had been outmaneuvered by a dead man in a drowned city, and she did not even know his real name. Only 2 people in the world heard that transmission and felt the hair rise on the back of their necks for the right reason. One was Endeavor, who had stood in Rapture and heard Ryan describe the parasite that had ruined his city. A man named Fontaine, who sold the people a dream and then sold them a chain, and called the chain freedom, and who now listened to a warm voice calling itself Atlas Confide about the rich man's rot, and thought, this is the chain seller. This is the man Ryan feared more than he feared us, and he is not asking us to save him. He is asking us to open a door. The other was Izuku Midoriya. He had no business being anywhere near it. He was a student, a 3rd year now at UA, a provisional license and a growing reputation, and the terrible secret weight of one for all that no one in the commission's briefings knew he carried. But heroes in training monitor the dispatch bands as part of their work studies, and Izuku had been in the agency common room when Atlas's voice came through the speakers, and he had gone very still, and the older heroes had seen the rescue and the injustice, and felt the pull toward the trapped and the poor, and Izuku had heard all of that too, and felt all of that too. The pull was real in him, realer than in any of them. But Izuku Midoriya had spent his whole life studying heroes and villains the way other boys studied sports, filling notebook after notebook, learning to read the shape of a person from the smallest tells, and there was something in the transmission that snagged on him. He listened to it 4 times that night, alone, headphones on, replaying the warm, cracking voice, and on the 4th pass he wrote in his notebook, in the cramped hand he used when he wasn't sure yet but couldn't let it go. He never says what he wants us to do, only what he wants us to feel. Ryan told us to leave, clear, specific, a real demand. Atlas asks us to come get them, but never says how, or where, or what's between us and them. Ryan wants an outcome. Atlas wants a direction. He's not asking to be rescued. He's asking us to walk somewhere. Why would a trapped man care which way his rescuers walk unless the walking is the point? He underlined the last line twice and sat staring at it and felt cold. He was 17, and he had no evidence, and the whole world was already lurching toward Atlas's version of events. And Izuku Midoriya did the only thing he could do, which was to take his notebook to the one adult who might listen. Not the Commission, not Endeavor, who he barely knew. He took it to the gaunt, dying man who had given him everything, the retired ghost of the symbol of peace, who had been present, silent and grave, at the edges of this whole affair because the Commission could not quite do without his judgment. He took it to All Might. They met on the roof of a UA building in the blue evening, the teacher who was no longer strong, and the student who now carried the thing that had made him strong. And Izuku laid the notebook out and said, all in a rush, "Sensei, I think everyone's reading it wrong. I think Atlas isn't a victim. I think he's the one Ryan was afraid of, and I think he's not asking us to save anyone. I think he's using the shape of a rescue to make us do something. Move somewhere, open something. I don't know what, but the words are," he tapped the page, "the words are built, like a trap is built. Everything he says makes you feel like helping, and never tells you what helping actually is." Toshinori Yagi read the cramped notes for a long time in the fading light, and then he did something he rarely did anymore, which was smile. A real one, sad and proud and frightened all at once. "You have gotten very good," he said quietly, "at seeing the thing under the thing." He handed the notebook back. "I read that transmission, and I felt the pull, my boy, toward the trapped, the poor, the children. I felt it in my bones, the way I have felt it my whole life, and I am not sure I would have looked past the pull to the architecture of it." He set his ruined hands on his knees. "You did. That is the difference between a hero who saves the person in front of him and a hero who saves the person he cannot see yet. Hold on to that." "Then you believe me," Izuku said, "that he's dangerous." "I believe," All Might said carefully, "that a man who can make an entire world feel its way into his hands, without ever once telling it the truth, is the single most dangerous thing this affair has produced. More dangerous than Ryan, who at least tells you what he is. More dangerous, perhaps, than the atom itself." He looked out at the city and the lights coming on across it. "Because the atom only takes the body. This man, Atlas, Fontaine, whatever his name is, takes the will. And a person will do things with a stolen will that no plague and no power could ever make them do." He did not know how right he was. Neither of them did. The phrase Ren Kobayashi had spoken in his withdrawal, "Would you kindly," had not yet connected in anyone's mind to the warm, confiding voice from the deep. The trigger sat there in plain sight, spoken already by a broken, quirkless man, and now by Atlas himself. And no one on the surface had yet understood that in Rapture, those three gentle words were not a courtesy. They were a leash. And down in the dark, Frank Fontaine listened to the surface world take his bait, heard the dispatch bands light up with heroes demanding to be sent, heard the news cycle turn against Ryan, heard the Commission's careful containment come apart at the seams, and he permitted himself the small satisfaction of a craftsman watching a machine run exactly as built. He did not need the heroes to save him. He had never needed saving. What he needed was for the door between Rapture and the surface to be held open, by rescuers, by ships, by the endless traffic of a world that had finally found his city, long enough for what he was building to get out. He had spent years in the dark, cultivating a garden of desperate men and hollow-eyed girls, and the crimson harvest that grew in them. He had a plan for it that Ryan had never imagined, that the Commission could not conceive of, that only a 17-year-old boy filling a notebook had come within a hair of seeing. "That's it," Atlas murmured, warm and kind and patient as the tide. "Come on down. Bring your ships and your heroes and your cameras. Would you kindly hold the door?" He smiled in the dark, and it was not a kind smile at all. "I've been waiting a long, long time for someone to hold the door." It came up with the tide, and it came up wrong, and Musutafu was never the same after the morning it walked out of the sea. The Commission had established a quarantine perimeter, buoys, patrol craft, a no-sail zone 40 kilometers wide, with the survey fleet at its center, and Rapture 2 kilometers below. What they had not planned for, because no one had told them it was possible, was that Rapture could send things up on their own. Not in bathyspheres, not through the careful docking stations. The city had other doors, older and cruder, pressure locks and flooded shafts meant for a kind of traffic the surface had no name for. And on the 9th morning one of them opened, and something began to climb. It took 6 hours to make the ascent that would kill any diver. It did not care. It was not, in the way that mattered, breathing. And at 6:14 in the morning, on a stretch of industrial coastline south of Musutafu, where the fishing fleet still worked, it walked out of the surf and into the human world, and the first person to see it was a boy of 9, named Sato, who had come down to the water to watch the boats, and who would, for the rest of his life, describe it in exactly the same words. A night, he said, a deep-sea night, and it was singing to a little girl. The Big Daddy stood over 2 meters tall and was nearly as wide, a hulking thing of riveted brass and salt-pitted iron, and a great round porthole helmet, from which a single amber light glowed like the eye of an anglerfish. Its diving suit had been a man once. The commission would confirm that later and would wish they hadn't, grafted and welded and grown into the metal, until there was no longer any seam between the flesh and the machine. On its back it carried a rivet gun the size of a fire hydrant. It moved with the slow, patient, unstoppable gait of something built to endure the crushing dark, and it moved that way for one reason and one reason only, because it was following the girl. She was small, 6, maybe 7, in a filthy blue dress, her feet bare, her skin gone gray as a drowned thing's, and her eyes glowed the same amber as the giant's porthole, a sick and lovely luminescence, and she carried in her small hands a long steel syringe, nearly as tall as she was, and she hummed as she walked, a wandering tuneless melody, the sort of song a child makes up to herself when she is alone, and has been alone a very long time. She wandered up the beach with the great armored guardian shadowing her every step, and she was looking for something, and when she found it, a dead fisherman who had drowned 3 nights before and washed up in the tide line, she knelt beside the corpse and drove her enormous needle into it, and began, humming all the while, to draw something out. The little sister was harvesting Adam from the dead, and the Big Daddy stood over her, turning its slow amber eye across the beach, and it let out a sound, a mournful, moaning whale song groan that carried for a kilometer and made every dog in the district start howling, and its meaning, though no human had taught it, was as clear as any language. Do not touch her, she is mine to protect. Do not come near. The local heroes came, of course. That was their job, and to their credit they came fast. A rescue-focused agency from the Musutafu suburbs, 4 heroes who had trained their whole lives to run toward the strange thing on the beach. They saw a monstrous armored figure looming over a terrified child with a needle, and they read it the only way their training let them read it. A villain, a victim, a rescue. They moved to save the girl. It was the worst thing they could have done. The Big Daddy's mournful song cut off. Its amber eye flared red, and the slow, patient guardian became, in the space of a heartbeat, a berserk engine of violence that crossed 20 meters of sand faster than a thing that size had any right to move. The first hero, a man whose quirk hardened his skin to stone, raised his arms to block a blow and had both of them broken. The Big Daddy hit him like a runaway truck and sent him 30 meters down the beach into the seawall, and the stone skin cratered and did not hold. The second hero it caught with the rivet gun, a burst of iron spikes the length of railroad ties, fired at a velocity that turned the industrial air into a scream, and only her quickness and a lucky roll kept the volley from doing worse than pin her jacket to a shipping container and leave her bleeding and pale in the sand. They radioed for help. The help they got was the one hero in range whose quirk was built, more than any other in the world, to shut down an out-of-control powered threat. Eraserhead arrived on the beach 11 minutes later. Shota Aizawa came the way he always came, quiet, unheralded, his capture weapon coiled at his throat, his eyes already sweeping the scene and cataloging it. He took in the 2 downed heroes, the humming child with her needle, the great armored thing standing guard, and he did what he had done 1,000 times, the thing that made him the single most feared man in Japan among quirk users. He fixed the monster in his gaze, his hair rising on the wind of his own quirk, his eyes going red, and he erased. Nothing happened. Aizawa had spent his entire career on the certainty of that moment. Look at a quirk user, cancel the quirk, and the strongest brute in the world became just a large person who could be handled by ordinary means. It had never failed him against a living opponent. He held his gaze on the Big Daddy, his eyes burning, his quirk pouring out of him and finding nothing. No quirk factor, no power to cancel. He was staring into the amber porthole of a thing that had been made, not born, whose strength came from grafted metal, and a body rebuilt by a substance grown in a child's belly, and there was simply nothing there for his quirk to touch. It was like trying to erase a tank, like trying to blink away a landslide. The Big Daddy did not have a quirk. It had atom, and iron, and rivets, and a purpose, and none of those were things Shota Aizawa could switch off with his eyes. The Big Daddy charged him. He was, being Aizawa, better prepared than any hero on Earth to have his one trump card fail, because his whole philosophy was that a hero who relied on their quirk was a hero one bad matchup from death, and he had trained his body precisely for the day his eyes stopped mattering. His capture weapon lashed out and caught the charging giant and used its own momentum to swing it wide. He moved like water, ducking the rivet gun volley, staying inside the thing's reach where its size worked against it, buying seconds. But he understood, with the cold clarity that made him a great teacher, that he could not win this. His quirk was useless. His body was a scalpel, and this thing was a wrecking ball. Every second he survived was a second borrowed, and the account was closing. And then the humming stopped. The little sister had looked up from the dead fisherman, and she was watching the fight with her glowing amber eyes, and something in her ruined child's mind connected the violence to the giant, and she did the thing that made the whole terrible arrangement work. She called out, a thin, piping, frightened little voice, the voice of an actual small girl underneath the monstrous alchemy, the voice of someone's daughter who had been turned into a factory for a substance men killed for. Mr. Bubbles, I'm scared. And the Big Daddy, the berserk, unerasable, unstoppable engine that had just broken 3 heroes on a beach, stopped. It turned from Aizawa completely, every ounce of its fury forgotten, and it went to the little girl, and it lowered its great riveted bulk down beside her, and it made that mournful whale song groan again, softer now, and the child pressed her gray face against the cold metal of its helmet, as if it were the only warm thing in the world. Aizawa stood on the beach with his capture weapon slack in his hands and his chest heaving, and he did not press the attack, because he had finally understood what he was looking at, and understanding it, took the fight out of him more thoroughly than any blow could have. It was not a monster guarding a victim. It was a monster that was a victim, guarding another one. He lowered his eyes. He let his quirk die. And he stood there on the cold sand in the gray morning and watched the huge armored thing hold the humming, glowing, gray-skinned child the way a father holds a frightened daughter, and Shota Aizawa, who had erased the quirks of villains and monsters and gods without a flicker of hesitation for 20 years, who had built his entire self around the ability to take power away, felt, for the first time in his career, that his quirk was the least relevant thing about him. There was nothing here to erase. There was only a wrong that had been done to 2 children, one of whom had been welded into a suit, and one of whom had been hollowed into a needle, and no power on earth that he possessed could undo it. When the commissioned tactical teams arrived 20 minutes later, hardened and numerous and equipped with tranquilizers that would eventually, at great cost, bring the Big Daddy down without killing it, they found Eraserhead sitting on the seawall with the rescued heroes, having ordered a full stand-down, refusing to let anyone approach the child while she was in the Guardian's arms. And when Madam President's liaison demanded to know why the #1 counter to powered threats had failed to neutralize the target, Aizawa looked at the man with his flat, exhausted eyes and said the sentence that would be quoted in the Commission's classified after-action report, and that would keep several of its authors awake at night. It doesn't have a quirk, he said. None of it does. Not the giant, not the girl, not the men from that city. My eyes are useless here. Everything we've built to control power, the licenses, the rankings, me, it's all built on the assumption that power comes from a quirk, and can be found, and can be cancelled. He looked out at the sea, at the place where Rapture waited 2 kilometers down. That city runs on something my eyes can't see, which means it runs on something we can't stop. He stood and gathered his capture weapon, and his voice went very quiet, and they turned a little girl into a well to draw it out of. Think about what kind of people do that. Then think about the fact that we've got a commission upstairs that heard power for sale and started making plans. He walked up the beach without waiting for a reply, past the humming child and her metal guardian, and he did not look back, because he was afraid that if he did, he would do something that was not in any way sanctioned, and that he would be right to. Far below, in the drowned dark, the warm voice had watched the whole thing on cameras the surface didn't know existed, and Frank Fontaine smiled his patient smile, because the Big Daddy on the beach had not been an accident, and had not been an escape. He had sent it. He had wanted the surface to see the child, and the guardian, and the terrible thing at the root of Rapture, because a world that had seen a little sister could not simply turn away from Rapture and forget it. A world that had seen a little sister would come down, some to save her, some to seize what she made. All of them through the door he needed held open. "Would you kindly," he murmured, watching the heroes carry the humming child toward the tide of everything that was coming, "look upon my children." And he laughed, low and warm and terrible, in the dark at the bottom of the sea. Tartarus does not have windows. It is the deepest prison in the world, a black site sunk into rock and secrecy, built to hold the one man the Hero Public Safety Commission feared above all others, and it was designed on a single principle, that its most important prisoner should be cut off, absolutely and forever, from any threat of the outside world. He was kept bound in the dark, sustained by machines, his ruined body strapped into a life support apparatus that was also a restraint, his face hidden behind a breathing mask, his every biological function monitored by men who had orders to kill him at the first ambiguity. All for one had been the shadow behind a century of villainy, the thief who had stolen quirks by the hundred, the ancient near-immortal will that had murdered generations of one-for-all's inheritors. They had caught him at Camino. They had buried him here, and they had told themselves, the way the Commission always told itself, that a thing buried deep enough was a thing safely forgotten. But information is water, and water finds the crack, and even Tartarus had cracks. A guard who talked in the break room, a doctor who read the classified briefings, a whisper passed down through the layers of a facility that could not entirely stop its own people from knowing the strange thing that was happening off the coast of Chiba. A drowned city, a substance that granted power, power that could be bought, that could be given to anyone, that did not care what a person had been born with. The whisper reached the deepest cell in the world. And Sensei, who had spent his imprisonment doing the one thing they could not take from him, which was to wait, to endure, to plan across a timescale no ordinary mind could hold, grew very, very still behind his mask when he heard it. For his entire monstrous life, all for one had been defined by a single method. He took. His quirk allowed him to reach into another person and pull their quirk out of them, to hold it, to stockpile it, to graft it into himself, or bestow it on a follower, a power built entirely on the theft of the powers of others. It had made him a god among men, but it had also chained him to a particular and grinding labor. Every quirk he wanted, he had to find, and reach, and steal, one body at a time. A century of patient acquisition, a century of hunting down the rare and the strong, and prying their gifts from their flesh. He had built an empire on it, and it had cost him decades, and even he, ancient as he was, had felt the slowness of it, the sheer inefficiency of a power that could only ever redistribute what already existed. And now, in the dark, strapped to a machine, a whisper reached him of a city that did not redistribute power. A city that manufactured it. He understood the difference immediately and completely, the way only a being who had spent 100 years thinking about nothing else could understand it. Adam was not a quirk to be stolen. It was worse, and better, and more. It was a factory. It grew power in the bodies of children, and drew it out with needles and refined it, and put it in bottles, and it could give abilities, plural, stacked, layered, to anyone with the will to inject it. He, all for one, could stockpile quirks, but he could only stockpile the quirks that other people had first been born with. Rapture had transcended that limit entirely. Rapture could grow power that had never existed in any bloodline. It could make gods out of the quirkless. It was the one thing in the whole history of the world that had done, industrially and cheaply, what he had spent a century doing by hand. He wanted it, not the way a greedy man wants a jewel. He wanted it the way a starving god wants the one food that could finally fill him. The men who guarded him noticed the change, though they could not name it. For years he had been a passive weight in his restraints, patient, dormant, giving them nothing. Now there was a new quality to his stillness, an attention, a coiled focus, the difference between a sleeping thing and a thing that has decided to wake. The chief warden filed a report. The report went up the chain. It reached, eventually, the desk of Madam President, and she read it and felt something cold move through her, because she had spent her whole tenure managing the assumption that all for one in Tartarus was a solved problem, and the report said, in the careful language of frightened men, that the solved problem had started paying attention to something. She did not yet know what, but there was one man who could have told her, and he was 2,000 meters underwater, and he had been thinking about all for one long before the Commission's report ever reached the surface. Andrew Ryan had studied the outside world's history obsessively in the years since Rapture surfaced into this timeline, had made his people bring him everything they could pull from the surface's networks, had sat in his office over the drowning city and read about quirks and heroes and the great regulated machine of it all, with the appalled fascination of a man watching a philosophy he despised made flesh. And he had read about all for one. And Andrew Ryan, whatever his monstrous flaws, was not a stupid man, and he saw in the imprisoned quirk thief the perfect and terrible mirror of the parasite that had ruined his own city. Fontaine, Ryan said to his empty office, to the neon and the dark, and this all for one, the same disease, wearing two faces. He poured a drink he would not finish. One sells the people a chain and calls it freedom. The other simply takes what other men have earned and calls it his right. Parasites. Both of them. The great enemy in all its forms. The man who will not build, and so must steal or swindle what better men have made. His pale eyes fixed on nothing. And if that imprisoned thief ever reaches my atom, if the parasite up there ever learns to drink from the well that Fontaine's parasitism has poisoned down here, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Because Andrew Ryan, tyrant and murderer, and the architect of a hell, understood a thing that the entire apparatus of hero society had not yet grasped, that the most dangerous being on the surface and the most dangerous substance in the deep were about to want each other, and that when a thief who could steal any power met a factory that could make any power, the result would not be a villain. It would be an ending. Deep in Tartarus, all for one did the arithmetic of his own liberation with the patience of a century. He could not reach Rapture from his cell. He could not so much as move his own hand without a machine's permission. But he did not need to move. He had never needed to move. His entire life's work had been done through others, through the cultivation of servants, the placement of pawns, the long, slow tending of a garden of loyal and useful men. He had a successor being raised in his image at this very moment, out in the world, gathering strength, a young man named Tomura Shigaraki, to whom he had already begun to pass the terrible inheritance, and who did not yet know his own destiny, but was being shaped toward it with every passing day. And the league that formed around that young man was a tool, and tools could be pointed. He would not escape Tartarus to reach Rapture. He would send his hand to fetch it. And when the atom came to him, when a bottle of the crimson stuff was placed in his ruined grip by a loyal servant, when he drank the manufactured power that no bloodline had ever carried, then the calculus of the entire world would change, because the one being who could stockpile power without limit would finally have a source without limit, and there would be no summit left for any hero to climb toward that he had not already claimed. He began, in the dark, in the silence of the deepest cell in the world, to plan. And 200 kilometers away and 2 kilometers down, on his stolen frequency, listening to the same whispers through the same cracks, Frank Fontaine, who missed very little, caught the scent of the imprisoned god's new attention, and understood, with the swindler's instinct that had never once failed him, that a new and enormous mark had just entered his game. A buyer with limitless appetite, a parasite even hungrier than himself. He should have been afraid. A lesser con man would have been. But Frank Fontaine had spent his whole life selling chains to men who thought they were buying freedom. and he looked at the shape of All for One reaching hungrily toward Rapture from his cell, and he did not see a threat. He saw a customer. "Now there's a fella," Atlas murmured, warm and delighted, in the dark. "There's a fella who wants what I'm sellin'." And Frank Fontaine, who had never in his life met a hunger he could not turn into a leash, began in his own way to plan too. Because if he could get his Adam up the door, he'd bribe the heroes into holding open, and into the grip of a thing that could give that power to an army. Then Frank Fontaine would not merely escape Rapture, he would inherit the world above it. Two parasites, 2 kilometers apart and 200 more, reached toward the same crimson substance from opposite ends of the sea, and between them, all unknowing, stood a commission that thought it was about to acquire a resource, a hero society, built entirely on the assumption that power could not be bought, and a 17-year-old boy with a notebook, who was the only living soul who had glimpsed, however dimly, the true shape of the trap. The door was still open, the tide was still coming in, and in Tartarus, for the first time in years, behind his breathing mask, All for One smiled. It got out the way Endeavor had known it would, not through the front door the commission was guarding, but through the 10,000 small doors no one can guard, the ones that open in the parts of a society that the shining machine of heroism has always pretended not to see. Because here is the thing about a promise made to the forgotten are everywhere, and they talk to each other. The commission had built its entire containment strategy around controlling the city, the fleet, the quarantine, the classified vaults, the careful management of what the public was allowed to know. But Adam had never needed the city to spread. It had needed only the thing Ren Kobayashi had proven in a bathroom in Tokyo, that a few microliters of crimson could turn a person who had been told all their life they could never be more into a person who, for 4 beautiful hours, was. And once one desperate person knows that, and tells another, and a third works out that the substance can be diluted and cut and sold, the promise stops being a secret and becomes a market. It surfaced first in the places the heroes patrolled least. The underworld the League of Villains moved through. The margins where the quirkless and the weakly quirked had always been pushed. The black clinics, the back rooms, the parts of the great cities that existed in the blind spots of the ranking system. Somebody, the commission never did establish exactly who, though the answer, had they known to look, was a warm voice on a stolen frequency, and a supply chain running up a door held open by their own heroes, began cutting Rapture's atom into doses a desperate person could afford, and calling it by 100 street names, and selling the oldest lie in the drowned city to a brand new world that had never learned to distrust it. You don't have to accept what you were born. You can be more. For a few weeks, the surface got to see the beautiful part. That was the cruelty of it, and Fontaine had counted on the cruelty. The first wave of buyers were exactly the people the story of Hero Society had always broken its promises to. The kid with the useless quirk, the adult who'd washed out of hero school, the quirkless who'd spent a lifetime in the margins. And for those first 4 hours, Adam did for them precisely what the posters promised. A boy who'd been told his whole life he was worthless stood in an alley and threw fire from his hands. A woman who'd never in her life been looked at with fear watched a mugger flee from the frost blooming across her knuckles. For a little while, in the blind spots of the world, the forgotten got to taste being powerful, and word of it ran through the margins like a grass fire, and everyone who heard it wanted in. Then the second wave came, and the second wave was the truth. The heroes started getting the calls in the 4th week. Domestic disturbances that turned out to be something else. A man in an apartment complex who wouldn't stop screaming, and when they broke the door down he was crouched in a nest of frost and ruin with his body wrong, and his eyes gone strange and bright, and he looked at the heroes and said, in a voice full of grief and appetite, "You have some. I can smell it. Would you kindly—" And then he came off the wall at them faster than a man should move, and he did not stop when they told him to, and he did not stop when they hit him, and some of them did not stop even after they should have been stopped, because the atom had rebuilt them past the point where a normal takedown worked. They had a name for it in Rapture. On the surface, the heroes coined their own, because the reports needed a word, and addict was not enough, and villain was not right. They called them splicers. Once someone leaked the Rapture term, and the name stuck because it was accurate, and because it was easier to fight a thing with a name. They were not villains, not in the way the hero system understood villains. A villain had a goal, an ideology, a demand. A villain was a person who had chosen. A splicer had no goal but the next dose. They were the wreckage of ordinary people, the boy who'd thrown fire in an alley and the woman who'd frosted a mugger's knuckles, come apart at the seams a few weeks later, when the 4 beautiful hours turned into a lifetime of hunger the body could not survive. They were fast and strong, and did not feel pain the way people did, and did not stop, and they attacked in the twitching, chattering, muttering way of things that had once been someone and could not get back. And every hero who fought one came away shaken, because you could not fight a splicer the way you fought a villain. You could only put down something that had, a month ago, been a frightened person who'd wanted, more than anything, to matter. And then came the part that broke the hero's understanding of the world entirely. The splicers came back. Rapture ran on a technology the surface had glimpsed but not believed, the Vita chamber, a device Ryan had installed throughout his city to keep his citizens from the inconvenience of death, a machine that reconstituted a body from its own genetic pattern the moment it fell, restoring it to life at the cost of nothing but a little of the atom in the air. In Rapture, the chambers had been tuned to Ryan's genetic signature, and later spread wider, and they were part of what had made the city's long civil war so endless and so hellish, a place where the combatants simply would not stay dead. And somebody, the same warm voice, the same held-open door, had begun getting Vita chamber technology onto the surface, seeding it into the underworld along with the atom, so that the network of splicers spreading through the margins of hero society was becoming, terrifyingly, a network that could not be permanently put down. A hero would fight a splicer and win, and file the report, and 3 days later fight what appeared to be the same splicer, resurrected in a stolen chamber somewhere in the dark, and the report started to read like something out of a nightmare, and the heroes fighting them started to fray, because there is a particular horror in defeating a thing, and having it come back, again, and understanding that the ordinary rules by which the world had always worked, you fight the bad thing, you win, it is over, had stopped applying. Izuku Midoriya fought his first splicer in the 6th week, in a rain-slicked underpass in Musutafu, and he would remember it for the rest of his life. He was on a work-study patrol, and the call came through, and he arrived to find a thing that had been a girl not much older than himself, a hero school washout, he'd learn later, a kid who'd had a weak quirk and a big dream, and had bought 4 hours of being more from a dealer in an alley, and paid for it with everything she was. She threw fire at him, wild and uncontrolled, incinerate, guttering from her hands, and she muttered as she did it, a low chattering stream of half-sentences, and in the middle of them, clear and terrible, she said, "I just wanted to matter. I just wanted to matter. Would you kindly let me matter?" And Izuku, who could have ended it fast with one for all, who had the power to simply win, found that he could not make himself do it fast, because the thing in front of him was wearing the face of every kid he'd ever met who'd been told their quirk wasn't good enough, every version of himself from before the day All Might had chosen him. He saved her. He would not stop trying to save her even when the older heroes told him she was too far gone, even when the atom had rebuilt her past the point of coming back, and in the end, he could only contain her, and hand her to the Commission's people, and stand in the rain shaking, because he had understood, in that underpass, the true shape of what Rapture had done to his world. It had taken the one wound at the heart of hero society, the promise it had always broken, to the weak and the quirkless and the forgotten, and it had turned that wound into a market, and it was selling the forgotten a 4-hour cure that killed them, and there was no villain to punch, no league to defeat, no single evil at the center of it that a hero could stand against and win. There was only the wound and the market that fed on it, and a warm voice at the bottom of the sea that had known, all along, that a society which breaks its promises to the powerless will always, always have customers. Endeavor, coordinating the hero response from the Commission's Crisis Center, watched the map of his country fill up with red markers, splicer incidents, atom seizures, Vita chamber discoveries, the slow, terrible spread of it through every blind spot the ranking system had ever pretended didn't exist, and he understood that the #1 hero was, for the first time in his career, fighting an enemy that his fists were completely useless against. You could not punch a market, You could not outrank a promise. He had spent his whole life becoming powerful enough to stand at the top of a system built on the assumption that power came from birth and could be measured and ranked and controlled. And that system was coming apart in front of him, not with a bang, but with 10,000 quiet transactions in 10,000 blind spots, each one a person choosing to buy the thing the world had told them they could never have. And the worst of it, the thing that kept him awake, was that he understood why they chose it. He had felt the pull himself. He knew, in the part of him he had spent his life refusing to look at, that if he had been born quirkless, if he had spent 30 years being told he could never be more, he would have bought it too, in a heartbeat, without agonizing. He would have gone down into the dark and bought it, and paid the price, and told himself the price was worth it, right up until the 4 hours ended and the hunger started. That was the trap Fontaine had built, and it had no bottom, and the surface was falling into it one desperate soul at a time. Down in the dark, the warm voice watched the red spread across the surface's maps, for Rapture had eyes up there now, riding the traffic through the open door, and Frank Fontaine felt the deep satisfaction of a salesman whose product has finally, fully, found its market. "There it is," Atlas murmured. "There's the whole rotten world of 'em, finding out what they do to be more than they were born." He smiled in the dark. Every last one of 'em thinking they're the exception, thinking they'll be the one who buys just a little, just a matter, just this once. The smile widened. That's the beautiful thing about the con, see? You don't have to force a soul to take the chain. You just have to show 'em the door, and let 'em walk through it their own selves, thanking you the whole way down. He turned from the cameras, back toward the deeper dark of the city, toward the humming children and the crimson harvest, and the great work still ahead of him. "Would you kindly," he said, "to the tide, to the world above, to the future, keep buying." The order came down on a single sheet of paper, and it was the most honest thing the Hero Public Safety Commission had produced in the entire affair, precisely because it was never meant to be seen. Endeavor read it in Madam President's office, alone with her, the door sealed. It was written in the cold, bloodless dialect the Commission used for its worst decisions, the language of assets and acquisition and managed outcomes, and it took him 3 passes to translate it fully into what it actually said, because his mind kept refusing the plain meaning. When he had it, he set the paper down on her desk very gently, the way you set down something you are afraid you will otherwise tear in half, and he looked at the woman who ran Hero Society in Japan, and he asked her to say it out loud, in plain words, so that one of them at least would have to hear it spoken. "The Little Sisters," he said. "You want to secure the Little Sisters." "I want to secure the supply," Madam President said, and she did not look away from him, and he had to give her that. She was not a coward, and she did not pretend. "You have seen the maps, Endeavor. You have seen what the uncontrolled market is doing. The splicers, the Vita chambers, the dead in the underpasses. This substance is loose in my country, and it is killing people, and the source of it, the only renewable source of it in the world, is inside a handful of children at the bottom of the sea." She folded her hands. "Those children produce Adam. Their altered biology grows it and refines it. Whoever controls them controls the only tap that cannot run dry. Right now, that is Fontaine, whoever he is, and he is using it to poison my cities. I intend to take the tap out of his hands and put it in ours, under commission control, regulated, rationed, dispensed by us, to whom we choose, or to no one at all." She let the silence sit for a moment. "That is not cruelty, Endeavor. That is the only path I can see that ends the plague. Secure the source, and the market dies." "They're children," Endeavor said. "They are the only thing standing between this country and a permanent, uncontainable supply of purchasable power." Madam President answered, "I am aware of what they are. I am also aware that if I do not secure them, then either Fontaine keeps flooding my streets, or—" And here her voice dropped, and for the first time something like real fear showed through the cold. "Or someone worse takes them first. You have read the Tartarus reports. You know what has started paying attention down there. Imagine those children, and what they produce, in the hands of all for one." She let that land. "I am not choosing between a good outcome and a bad one. I am choosing the least catastrophic of a set of nightmares. That is the entire job. That is what this chair is. And the terrible thing, The thing Endeavor carried out of that office and could not put down was that she was not wrong. Every word of it was defensible. Secure the source, starve the market, keep the tap from the imprisoned god. It was the logical, responsible, load-bearing decision of a person tasked with protecting a nation. It was also an order to go down into the dark and take custody of hollowed-out little girls and keep them, forever, as a resource, to make the commission into the thing Andrew Ryan had built Rapture to escape, the committee that claims the fruit of another's body for the greater good. Fontaine had turned children into wells, and now Hero Society, to stop him, was proposing to keep them as wells, only with better paperwork. Endeavor did not agree, and he did not refuse, and that failure to do either was the most honest thing he did in the whole affair, because he felt the logic pulling at him the way the atom had pulled at his blood, and he was no longer certain, at 46 years old, with everything he now knew about the cost of his own certainties, that he could trust his own hand to choose right. So he did the one thing left to a man who does not trust himself. He went and found the people he trusted more. The meeting was not sanctioned. It happened in a UA classroom after hours, and it was small, and it was the strangest council of war ever assembled to decide the fate of 6 drowned children, the retired ghost of the symbol of peace, gaunt in the corner, Shota Aizawa, who had stood on a beach and found his quirk useless and his conscience loud, a scientist refugee the fleet had pulled up out of Rapture 2 weeks earlier, a hollow-eyed woman with a German accent and hands that never quite stopped shaking, named Brigid Tenenbaum, the #1 hero, and, because Aizawa had insisted and because it turned out to matter, a 17-year-old boy with a notebook full of everything he'd figured out that the adults hadn't. It was Tenenbaum who broke first, and it was Tenenbaum who changed everything, because she was the only person in the room who had actually made a little sister, and had spent every day since trying to unmake what she'd done. "I did this," she said, and her voice was flat and ruined, and did not ask for absolution, because she did not believe she deserved any. "You understand? Not Fontaine, not Ryan, me. I found the sea slug that makes the atom. I found that a child's body, a little girl's body, could host it, and grow it, and refine it, far better than any adult. I did the science. I made the first ones. I told myself it was necessary, that it was for the work, that they were," her hands twisted in her lap, "that they were not really children anymore, that the process took the child away and left only the little factory behind. I told myself that so I could keep working. The way your commission is telling itself that now." She looked up and her eyes were terrible. "It is a lie. I know because I stopped believing it. There is a child still in there. Under the glow, under the humming, under the needle, there is a little girl who is still there, and who can be brought back. I have done it. I have taken the slug from a few of them and made them children again. Frightened, confused, orphan children, yes, but children, human, free." Her jaw set. "It can be undone. That is the only thing I have left to say to a room full of people deciding what to do with them. It is not a resource that happens to look like a child. It is a child that has been made into a resource, and the two are not the same, and every man who tells you they are the same is telling you so that he can use her." The room was silent. Aizawa was looking at the floor. All Might had closed his eyes. And Endeavor, who had spent a lifetime treating the children in his own house as resources, as vessels for a quirk he wanted, as means to an end he'd told himself justified everything, sat in that classroom and felt the words go through him like a blade, because he had made that exact lie, in that exact shape, about children who shared his own blood. They are not really children right now. They are the raw material of the hero I am building. He had believed it for years. He had broken his family on it. And here was a stranger from the bottom of the sea saying the thing he had spent the last 2 years of painful, insufficient penance learning. The two are not the same, and every man who tells you they are is telling you so that he can use her. He stood up. It was not a decision he arrived at so much as one that arrived at him, all at once, complete. "I'm not going to secure them," he said. "I'm going to save them." "The commission's order," Aizawa began. "I know what the order says." Endeavor's voice was low and rough. "I've spent my whole life following the logic that says the ends justify what you do to the people in your way, that the mission is bigger than the person in front of you. that you can treat a child as a means, because the goal is worth it. He looked at Tenenbaum. I broke people I loved on that logic. I'm not going to break 6 more strangers on it just because the woman giving the order is right about the strategy. She's right about the strategy. She's still wrong. Both things are true. I've finally lived long enough to understand that both things can be true, and that when they are, you choose the child. It was Izuku who spoke then, quiet, from the edge of the room, the boy who had seen the shape of the trap before anyone. It's what he wants, he said. All of them turned. Fontaine, Atlas. Don't you see? He wants the commission to seize the sisters. He set it up. He had his notebook open, the cramped pages full of it. Think about it. He sent the big daddy up the beach so we'd see a little sister. He flooded the streets with Adam, so we'd get desperate to control the source. Every single thing he's done has been pushing hero society toward one choice. Go down into Rapture and take the children. Because the moment we do that, the moment the great heroes of the surface descend into the dark to seize custody of little girls as a strategic resource, his voice shook. We become the thing that makes Rapture make sense. We prove Ryan right. We prove that the outside really is the parasite that reaches for what another man made. And we walk right into a city that is his, full of his splicers, and his chambers, and his traps, holding the moral high ground we just threw away. He looked up. He's not defending the children from us. He's using them as bait, to get the best heroes in the world to come down into his house, on his terms, so he can spring whatever the real plan is. The silence after that was different. It was the silence of a room full of people, realizing that the boy was right, and that the choice in front of them was not seize or save, but something far worse. That saving the children was the right thing, and the trapped thing at the same time. That the honest path and the ambush ran through the exact same door, and that Fontaine had built it that way on purpose, because a con man who understands the human heart does not offer you a choice between good and evil. He offers you a choice between 2 goods, and makes sure that both of them lead where he needs you to go. Then we go down, Endeavor said, knowing it's a trap, and we spring it on our own terms, and we save them anyway. He looked around the small unsanctioned council. Because the alternative is to leave 6 children in the dark to protect ourselves from an ambush. And if we do that, if we let the fear of his plan turn us into people who abandon children at the bottom of the sea, then he's already won, whether we ever set foot in Rapture or not. He doesn't need to spring a trap on people who've already stopped being heroes. He picked up Izuku's notebook, looked at the pages of a boy who saw the thing under the thing, and set it back down. We know it's a trap. We go anyway. That's the whole job. That's what this is. Tenenbaum looked at him for a long moment. This scarred stranger from the surface, who had just chosen the harder path with his eyes open, and something in her ruined face eased, very slightly, for the first time since the fleet had pulled her from the sea. Then I will show you the way down, she said, and I will show you how to save them. And God help all of us. Her accent thickened on the words, because the man waiting for us at the bottom of that sea has been building his whole life toward exactly this, and he does not lose. Far below, on his stolen frequency, the warm voice had not heard the classroom. Even Fontaine's reach did not extend to a sealed UA room after hours, but he did not need to. He had built the machine, and he knew what it would do. He knew the heroes would come, because he had left them no path that did not lead down, and he sat in the drowning dark at the heart of his city, among the humming children and the waiting splicers, and the great terrible work of years, and he made ready to receive his guests. Come on down, heroes, Atlas murmured, warm as a father, patient as the tide. Would you kindly? And in the deep, the door stood open, and beyond it, everything he had built lay waiting in the dark. They went down in the dark, and the dark took them the way the sea takes everything, without malice and without mercy, and Rapture closed over their heads like a lid. The descent party was small by necessity. The bathyspheres held only so many, and the deeper truth was that an army was exactly what Fontaine wanted them to bring. So they brought the opposite, Endeavor, Aizawa, Tenenbaum, to guide them and to unmake what she had made, and Izuku Midoriya, who had fought to come, and whom Endeavor had, after a long silence, allowed, because the boy saw the shape of things no one else did, and because, though the number 1 did not say this part aloud, a mission built on refusing to abandon children could not begin by leaving behind the one who most understood why. All Might did not come. He could not. His body would not survive it, and he knew it, and the not coming cost him something visible. He gripped Izuku's shoulder at the waterline and said only, "See the thing under the thing, my boy, all the way to the bottom." And then the door of the bathysphere closed and they sank. Rapture received them the way a spider receives a fly, with a great and patient hospitality. The bathysphere docked itself, guided by hands they never saw, and the water drained, and the doors opened onto the drowning city, and the warm voice was waiting for them on every speaker in the station, kind and glad and terrible. "There you are," Atlas said. "There's my heroes. Come a long way, haven't ye? Come all the way down into the dark for a handful of little girls." A warm chuckle, fond as a father's. "That's the good in ye. That's the thing I've been counting on this whole time. Would you kindly come this way now? The children are waitin'. Just follow the sound of 'em hummin'. Would you kindly?" And they went, because the children were humming. They could hear it, thin and wandering, echoing up through the flooded corridors. And because every instinct a hero has is built to move toward a child's voice in the dark, and because they had known, going in, that the honest path and the trap ran through the same door, they followed the humming, through the water-stained mahogany and the guttering neon and the corpse-cold beauty of the dead city, and the splicers watched them from the shadows and did not attack, because Fontaine had called them off, because Fontaine wanted his guests delivered whole. Every "would you kindly" that came through the speakers moved them a little further in. Would you kindly take the left passage? Would you kindly mind the flooded stair? Would you kindly keep comin'? You're almost there. It was Izuku who stopped. He stopped in a flooded gallery halfway to the humming, and the others turned, and he stood very still with his notebook clutched in his hand, and his face gone white, and he said, "He keeps saying it." "Saying what?" Aizawa said. "Would you kindly?" Izuku's voice was shaking. "He says it every time, every instruction. Would you kindly come this way? Would you kindly take the left passage? I thought it was just a tick, a way of talking. But it's not, it's..." He flipped back through the notebook with frantic fingers, to a page written weeks ago, in an underpass in the rain. "The splicers say it. The atom addicts. Ren Kobayashi said it. The first one, the lab tech. He said it in his cell. Would you kindly give it to me? The girl I fought in the underpass said it. Would you kindly let me matter? They all say it. Everyone the atom touches says it. Why would strangers who never met each other all use the exact same 3 words? He looked up, and the horror was total. Because it's not a phrase. It's a command. It's built into them. Into the atom, into the process, into whatever Fontaine did when he made this city. Those 3 words aren't a courtesy, they're a key. And when he says them, the person who hears them has to obey." His voice cracked. "He's not asking us to come this way. He's making us. We've been following orders since the second the door opened and we thought we were choosing." The speakers were silent for a moment, and then the warm voice laughed, low and delighted, and no longer bothering to be kind. And Frank Fontaine let the mask of Atlas fall away for the first time, and the accent underneath it was flat and hard and American and entirely pleased. "Well now," Fontaine said, "ain't you the clever one? Took you longer than I'd have liked, kid. But you got there. Most never do." The neon flickered. Somewhere ahead, the humming of the children stopped. "You're right. Of course. Would you kindly?" 3 little words. I built 'em into everything down here a long time ago. Into the atom, into the conditioning, into the very meat of anyone who takes the plunge. A man hears those words from me. He does what I say, and he thanks me for the privilege. And the beauty of it, the real beauty, is he never knows. Thinks he's choosing the whole time. Just like your heroes up top, buying my product, thanking me for the door. The voice hardened. "And now here you are, 4 of ye, deep in my house, exactly where I wanted ye, because I said 3 little words and your good hearts did the rest. So..." A pause, savoring it. "Would you kindly stand still?" And Endeavor's body locked. It was the most horrifying thing the #1 hero had ever felt. Worse than any wound, worse than any defeat, because it did not feel like being controlled. It felt like choosing. His muscles stopped and his fire banked, and every part of him agreed, warmly and completely, that standing still was exactly what he wanted to do, and only the small screaming core of him, that was still Enji Todoroki, understood that the wanting was not his. Beside him, Aizawa froze the same way, his capture weapon going slack. Tenenbaum stood rigid, tears standing in her eyes, because she had known about the trigger, had lived in a city ruled by it, and had not understood until this instant that it would take the heroes too, that Adam in the water and the air had seeped into them enough over their weeks of proximity to make the words bite. Only Izuku Midoriya did not freeze. He would spend a long time afterward trying to understand why, and the answer, when he found it, was the truest thing this whole story had to teach. It was not that One for All protected him, though it did, a little. It was that One for All was not a quirk in the way Adam understood quirks, and it was more than that too. It was 7 souls. All for One had never been able to simply take it because it was passed, given, willed from one holder to the next, carrying the wills of everyone who had ever borne it. And when Fontaine's 3 words reached into Izuku Midoriya to seize his will, they found that his will was not alone in there. 7 predecessors stood with him, 7 wills that had each, in their turn, chosen to carry the fire, chosen to pass it on, chosen freely, in a way Rapture's conditioning could not comprehend, because Rapture ran on the theft of choice, and One for All ran on its gift. The command found a boy who was not one will to be captured but a lineage of wills freely joined, and it could not get a grip, the way a hand cannot grip water, and Izuku Midoriya stayed free. He understood it in a flash, not the whole mechanism, but the essential thing. He made everyone say his words except me. And the reason it's me is the reason his whole city is a lie. You built all of this, Izuku said, and his voice rang out clear in the flooded gallery, on taking people's choices away. The atom, the words, the splicers, the sisters, every single thing in Rapture is you stealing what people would have chosen for themselves and selling it back to them as freedom. That's what Ryan couldn't beat, isn't it? Because Ryan believed in choice so hard he couldn't imagine an enemy who'd steal it. And that's why you'll lose. One for All flared green and gold across his whole body, the light of 7 souls. And it did not so much as flicker under the weight of Fontaine's command. Because the one power in this whole world you could never counterfeit, never steal, never fake, is a thing that's given. And that's the only thing I'm made of. And Frank Fontaine, for the first time in his long and profitable life, felt something he had never once felt, the cold slide of a con going wrong, because standing in his house, at the bottom of his sea, wrapped in his trap, with 3 frozen heroes beside him, was a single boy his magic words could not touch, glowing with a power he could not buy, could not steal, could not understand, and could not stop. He sent everything he had. The splicers came out of the walls in a screaming tide, and the traps sprang, and the water itself seemed to turn against them, and Izuku Midoriya, moving faster than anything Rapture had ever seen, went through all of it. He broke the console, feeding Fontaine's voice into the water, and the pressure of the words on his frozen friends eased, and Endeavor's fire roared back to life, and the number 1 hero came off his knees like a furnace given form, and Aizawa's eyes went red, and though he could not erase what had no quirk, he could still fight like the deadliest man alive once his body was his own again. They cut through the splicer tide. They fought toward the humming that had gone silent, toward the children, through a drowning city that had been built on the theft of choice by a man who was, at last, meeting the one thing he could not swindle. Tenenbaum reached the sisters first. 6 of them, huddled and glowing and frightened, herded there as bait, and she went to them with her ruined hands and her German murmur and the cure she had spent her ruined life perfecting. And one by one she began to give them back the thing Rapture had stolen, their childhood, their choice, their selves. And somewhere in the deep, in a boardroom-turned tomb, Andrew Ryan heard the sounds of his enemy's plan coming apart, heard a con man's empire cracking against a boy made of given power, and the tyrant who had built a hell out of his love of choice, permitted himself, at the very end, a single grim and terrible satisfaction, because whatever else was true, the parasite Fontaine was finally losing, and Andrew Ryan had always known that the man who steals another's will must, in the end, meet a will he cannot take. A man chooses, Ryan said softly, to the dark, to the boy he would never meet, to the ruin of everything. A slave obeys. He almost smiled. And you, boy, you are no slave of his. I can hear it from here. The neon flickered over the drowning city. Good, good, let him learn it. Let him learn it the way I never could make him learn anything at all. Above them, through 2 kilometers of black water, the door stood open. But for the first time since Rapture rose, the thing coming through it was not going to be what Frank Fontaine had planned. The end of Rapture was not an explosion. Cities like Rapture do not end in explosions. They end the way they lived, in the dark, in the water, with a con man talking right up until the moment there is no one left to con. Fontaine ran, because that was the one thing Frank Fontaine had always done supremely well. When the boy his words could not touch tore through his splicers and his traps, when the frozen heroes came unfrozen and the furnace that was Endeavor filled the flooded corridors with a light Rapture had never held, when the thing he had built to be inescapable started, impossibly, to fail, Fontaine did what all his kind do at the end. He reached for more. He had held it in reserve for exactly this, a stockpile of atom meant to make him the god of the world above, and now, cornered in the drowning heart of his city, he injected all of it at once. Every plasmid, every tonic, the whole crimson harvest of years poured into one body, and Frank Fontaine stopped being a man, and became the last and largest of his own monsters, a towering thing of fire and lightning and molten atom, glowing from within, the con made flesh. It should have been the end of them. Against anyone else it would have been. But the thing about a power that is taken is that it is never truly yours, and the thing about a power that is given is that it never stands alone. Fontaine, swollen with all the stolen power in the world, faced a boy who carried the freely passed wills of 7 predecessors and, beside that boy, the #1 hero who had finally, at the end of a long and terrible life, learned what his power was for. Endeavor did not fight Fontaine the way he had once fought, for the ranking, for the glory, to be the strongest thing his birth allowed. He fought the way he had watched a dead symbol fight, and never understood until now, to put himself between the monster and the children. Hellflame and One for All, the born power and the given one, wielded at last by 2 people who had stopped fighting for themselves, and the manufactured god, for all his crimson glut, could not stand against them, because he had never in his life understood the one thing that made them unbeatable. He had spent decades learning to steal what people would have chosen. He had never once learned to give anything away, and so when the 2 of them broke him, in the flooded dark, with the humming children freed behind them, and Tenenbaum shielding the last of the sisters with her own body, Fontaine died the way he had lived, reaching for more, and finding, for the first time, that there was nothing left to take. Andrew Ryan did not run. They found him in his office over the drowning city, and he was waiting, and he had a golf club in his hand for reasons none of them understood and he never explained. And he looked at the boy glowing green and gold, and the burning hero beside him, with something that was almost, unbearably, peace. His city was ending. His great experiment, his cathedral to the sovereign will, had rotted and drowned and now would be pulled apart by the very outside he had built it to escape. And Andrew Ryan, tyrant and murderer and true believer to the last, chose the only thing a man like him has left to choose at the end, which is the manner of his own ending. They will say I was a monster, he said, to Endeavor, to the boy, to the dark. Perhaps I was, but I built a place where a man was more than the accident of his birth, where he could choose what he became, and pay the price of it himself, and answer to no committee, no king, no god. His pale eyes found Izuku and held. Your world hands out power like alms and calls the receivers heroes. My world let a man earn it, and it damned him, and I would rather be damned by my own hand than saved by another's. That is the whole of the difference between us, boy, and I would build it all again. He set down the golf club. Now get out of my city. It was never yours to save. He would not be taken alive, and in the end they did not force it. And how exactly Andrew Ryan left the world is a thing the 4 of them never spoke of again, except that Endeavor said once, much later, that the man had died the only free thing in a city he had built to be free, and had known it, and had wanted it that way. A man chooses. Ryan had spent his life on those words. He met his end on them too. They brought the children up. That was the mission, in the end, stripped of everything else. The splicers and the plasmids and the philosophy and the drowning god, all of it fell away, and what was left when the bathysphere breached the surface at dawn was 6 little girls, frightened and blinking in a light they had not seen in a very long time, their eyes no longer glowing, the humming gone quiet, human again. Tenenbaum's cure had held. She sat among them on the deck of the survey ship as the sun came up over the water, this ruined woman who had made them and then unmade what she'd made, and she did not weep, because she did not think she had the right to, but she held them, and they let her, and that was something. The world above never went back to what it had been. That was the true and permanent mark of it, the thing that outlasted Rapture itself. You cannot unknow that power can be bought. The Commission spent years and enormous secrecy and no small amount of blood hunting down the atom that had gotten loose, and the Vita chambers that had spread, and the splicers who kept resurfacing in the blind spots of the world. And they never got all of it, because you never do. Somewhere in the margins of hero society, in the places the ranking system still pretended not to see, the promise Fontaine had made lived on, whispered from one desperate soul to another. You don't have to accept what you were born. It was a lie that killed the people who believed it. It was also, and this was the part that kept Endeavor awake, true, and a society built entirely on the belief that power came from birth and could not be redistributed, had heard, once, that it could be, and would never fully unhear it. The quirkless had glimpsed a door. The wound at the heart of hero society had been named out loud. Nothing about that could be sealed back into the dark, however deep they sank the city. In Tartarus, All for One did not get his prize. The atom never reached his cell. The factory was drowned. The sisters saved. The crimson tap shut off before his reaching hand could close on it. He returned to his patient waiting, and to the successor he was still, slowly, shaping in the world above. And if he was disappointed, he did not show it, because a being who thinks in centuries does not grieve a single lost opportunity. He had learned something, though. He had learned that power could be manufactured, not merely stolen, that somewhere in the shape of the world was a way to make gods wholesale, and not one at a time by his own hand. He filed it away in the vast cold ledger of his ambition. He was very good at waiting, and the knowledge that such a thing was possible, once known, is also a thing that cannot be unknown. As for the children, Brigid Tenenbaum took them. She fought the Commission for them, and against her. At last, and to his own surprise, she had the #1 hero, who stood in Madam President's office one final time and told her that the 6 little girls from the bottom of the sea were not assets and would never be assets, and that if the Commission wished to make them into a resource, it would have to go through Endeavor to do it, and that the Commission did not, on balance, wish to do that. Madam President looked at him for a long moment, at this man she had ordered to seize them, and who had chosen instead to save them, and something in her cold and load-bearing face shifted, very slightly, and she signed the release. She was not, whatever else she was, a monster. She had only been standing in the chair where the nightmares came to be chosen between, and for once, someone had shown her a choice that was not a nightmare, and she had taken it. They went with Tenenbaum, the 6 of them, to a quiet place, to be children, to be free, which was the one thing Rapture had never let anyone truly be, and the one thing hero society, at its best, when it remembered what it was for, still could. Izuku Midoriya wrote it all down, of course, filled a notebook with it, the way he filled notebooks with everything. But the last thing he wrote was not analysis, not a power breakdown, not a tactical note. It was a single line, on the last page, after everything, and he underlined it twice, the way he did when he was sure. Given is stronger than taken, every single time. That's the whole thing. That's what a hero is. Far below, the sea closed over the place where Rapture had been, and the drowned lights guttered and went dark one by one, and the great glass city that a man had built to be free of gods and kings and committees sank back into the black it had come from, taking its beauty and its horror and its terrible seductive promise down with it. But not all the way down, never quite all the way, because some things, once they have risen, can never be fully sunk again, and the world above had seen the door, and drunk from the crimson, and learned the one lesson that changes everything and can never be untaught, that power is not always a birthright. Sometimes it is for sale, and a world that knows that is not the same world that didn't. The tide came in over the empty water, and somewhere in the margins, in the blind spots, in the places the light of hero society still would not reach, a desperate soul who had been told all their life they could never be more heard a whisper about a substance that did not care what you were born with, and leaned in. The city was gone, but the question it asked never left. Hero society had been built on a single unspoken certainty. That power came from birth, fixed and final, distributed by the accident of blood, and managed forever by the machine of licenses and rankings and the Commission's cold hand. Rapture had risen out of the dark and proven that certainty a lie. And though they drowned the city and saved the children and hunted down the crimson stuff for years, they could never quite drown the lie's undoing. The quirkless had glimpsed a door, and doors, once seen, do not close. Endeavor went back to being the #1 hero of a world that had changed underneath him, and he carried what he'd learned at the bottom of the sea, that he had spent his life fighting to be the strongest thing his birth allowed, and had only become a hero the day he stood between a monster and a child he had no reason to save. Aizawa went back to teaching, and told no one what he'd felt on that beach, when his all-powerful eyes had found nothing to erase, and he'd understood how much of what he was rested on assumptions the world could break. Tenenbaum vanished with 6 children into a quiet life, unmaking her sins one saved girl at a time. And Izuku Midoriya kept his notebook and its last underlined line, and carried the truth of Rapture forward into everything he became, that the one power no one can ever steal, or buy, or counterfeit, is the power that is freely given, and that this, and only this, is the whole and secret strength of a hero. Deep below, the sea kept Rapture's grave, and in the margins of the world above, the whisper went on.